we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi.
Happy spring. It was below 32 degrees where I came from. We didn't even have that kind of weather in the wintertime.
No.
You know, it's typical what happens to us, but I'm glad to be here and hope everybody's nice and toasty warm, because we'll remember this nice cool snap when it's 100 degrees and 100% humidity next week. Yeah, that's how it works here. All right, today we're going to talk about some addendums that we add to the contract. Sometimes our clients want them facilitated. And my reason for reviewing these with you is because nobody has ever read them. And the last dispute I had with it, there were 4 attorneys involved. Each one of the brokers had to have their own attorney, and then the landlord and tenant, former buyer and seller, both had attorneys. And it was at that day, you know how you have an epiphany, and I said, we're not gonna go through this again. Because when the agents are brought back into something that has nothing to do with them, many times the agent has a hard time, extricating themselves from it, because that might be a good, and it is, they're part of your sphere of influence. They might send you referrals in the future, and you're thinking, I need to extend myself, and I don't want you to get somewhere where you don't belong, because it could result in an action on your part, and it's already closed, and the carrier are going to say, well, this doesn't involve any transaction you were involved in, and that's right, because temporary leases, the buyer temporary lease, which we'll talk about, it has its own issues, but a seller's temporary residential lease is an actual lease between a landlord and tenant. It's only added to our contract so that the parties can agree to it, but the moment it closes in fund, where's the agent in this? Is the agent done? You betcha. You're done. Your job is completed. And what happens is they pull you back in like this big tornado into it, and you don't know how to get out of it. And I don't want you to be somewhere, say something, and then you will have no errors of omission coverage because you're not involved in a transaction. It's done. It's already closed. Leases are very, I spent the last few months talking about the leases and the lease listing agreements. Leases are very complex transactions, and they go very, very fast, but this little temporary lease has the same impact statutorily as the big lease. So I want to make sure everybody understands there's a few extra provisions that are different than what we see on our normal leases, but I want you to be aware of it so that you don't get into the same situation that we had all these agents in. It went on for 45 days, so be careful about that. Okay.
Marilyn, do you want to get mic'd up?
They have never liked me, but they could if you want me to.
Do y'all feel like y'all need her? Can y'all hear her?
I can hear. But that's fine. Okay, we're going to go through the seller's temporary residential lease and all of its pitfalls, because that's what we're going to see more often. We sent out a best business practice a couple of years ago when we were having many issues, and this was before the TRID and the CFPB. We were having issues where buyers, lenders, were not ready to close on the closing date, and sellers were thinking, I need to pack up, get out. Some of them went into temporary, leases, or they went somewhere temporarily till their new construction was completed. And the worst thing is for a listing agent to get the call, the buyer's not closing today, and your seller has moved out. So several years ago, we talked about the best business practice. And for a seller, the best business practice is at time of offer, that seller's temporary residential lease needs to be on the contract. That's an issue that the parties want to make sure that they have a provision for in the event that there's that element of not sure it's going to close on the closing day. And the problem is that the seller only has a position of power until they sign the contract. Once that contract is executed, a seller has no provision anywhere to terminate. Not one bit of ability to say to the buyers, go away, I don't like you. They can never do that. The buyers have lots of provisions in their contingencies where they may be able to tell the seller, I terminate and I get my earnest money back. But there is no provision for a seller to do that. And that's why we say that it's a position of power, only for that very short window of time before a seller actually signs the contract. Okay, so we want to make sure everybody understands why these are done at time of offer instead of 2 weeks in. This is past the termination option period. 2 weeks in, the buyers and sellers don't like each other. For some odd reason, I don't know, they've never even met, but they don't like each other. And then the sellers come to the listing agent, oh my gosh, we have to get 9 more days after we close. We just found out they're not gonna have our house ready or whatever. And then the seller wants to ask the buyer for something, and the buyer says no. Well, the sellers are stuck. They can't force the buyers to do something. Actually, nobody gets to force any party. If you know through negotiations, it's got to be mutual. They've got to mutually decide, okay, we're going to extend the contract or add the seller's temporary residential lease. But if a buyer said no to a seller at that point, that poor seller is done. And we've had that situation too often. And I'm going to tell you, I know the problem. It's the agent's fault. Those buyers and sellers sometimes have never met each other. But the agents have kind of interjected a little bit, and so what happens, your party gets upset with the other, they don't even know. So that's why I say it's the agent's fault, because the agents who handle highly stressful, complicated negotiations and transactions, and yet their clients at the closing table are still happy, those are the great agents. It's not easy to facilitate that either. We've got parties who don't see reason, so it's not all the agent's fault. But again, those agents were able to kind of rise above the petty fray that was going on as communication, not really meant towards the clients themselves, but just how it can be. The form I'm going to provide to you is a form that you better use in your tool chest, because it'll be your kind of, God bless you, it'll be kind of your get out of trouble acknowledgement. And what it says to the seller is exactly what they're willing to accept if they want to add the seller's temporary residential lease on the contract. It's not going to stop them. I just want them to know what is your role and what is their duty. And a lot of times they fail to see it that way because they think they still own the property. I have too many sellers. This last seller where the sheriff was called out twice. The first time the sheriff advised the buyers, the sellers who are now tenants, you better get out of this property. That was on a Friday. And on Sunday, the sheriff that came out, the new buyer, who is the landlord, hadn't had his driver's license changed, but he had all his closing docs, and he proved to the sheriff that he owned the property, and they said, no, we only go by the driver's license. And he said, you get off this property or we're going to arrest you. You know, so it was just like nobody could win at all. And here we were, 2 brokerages, 2 agents, 2 attorneys representing us. We were all sucked into this vortex that was never ending. So we want to talk about that acknowledgement. The other one is the buyer's acknowledgement of the seller's temporary residential lease. As a buyer's agent, you're working with a first-time home buyer. They don't even know how to care for a home, and you're going to make them a landlord? That's what they need to know, and it's a profound impact in how they'll conduct themselves. There's a lot of laws that govern landlords in the state of Texas, and I don't know about you, but I never want to be a landlord because you have so many statutes that come over you, and if you say, I'm a landlord, that means you have read the Texas Property Code Chapter 92, and you understand it, and you know how to facilitate every one of those issues. And there are not very many landlords that can say that. How many of you are property managers? There's a good reason for that. Property management is a very highly specialized form of real estate practice. It is, according to the National Association of Realtors, the riskiest position in real estate. Property management causes more issues and claims and lawsuits than any other issue. And most of what we deal with are property condition. Those are usually what face it. But property managers, they are constantly being placed in distressful situations. Somebody is upset about something. And those property managers, they have to know everything perfectly because everything has to be executed perfectly every time, or they would be subject to penalties. The next one is we're gonna look at the buyer's temporary residential lease. It's similar to the seller's, but of course it's gonna be positioned so that the landlord, the current seller, absolutely knows that they have a tenant in the property, even though they happen to be a buyer of the property. There are a couple extra provisions in their lease that are not gonna be the same as the provisions you'll see in the seller's temporary residential lease. And then the last one is, you know, how many of you like ice cream? Thank you. Baskin and Robbins had a flavor of the month, you know. I can still remember when they first started, before most of you were born. And it was wonderful, you know, Jamal Comet fudge one time, and next one was praline and cream, and they had that. Well, what we're gonna do this year is a form of the month. Trek only takes care of the contractual and legal obligations of the parties. So they're not our documents that we use all the time. The contract forms are mainly what they're, you know, interested in. But our association, Texas Association of Realtor, and somewhat HAR, they provide us individual forms that we use to help facilitate the transaction. They may not be on your required list, but let me tell you, there are a lot of them that are perfect when you get into that situation. So what my goal is this year is to kind of show you one every month and think, do you have a situation where this might have been a good form to use? Most of them are not forms that are going to be seriously involved with a lot of fill in the blanks. They're mostly notices. In other words, we're giving advice to the other party and saying, you need to be aware of these things. And this month, we're going to talk about the notice of buyers, agents, and seller. And the reason is we're getting a little bit more activity going on right now in the market. And at this time of year, there are a lot of individuals who want to sell their property. They find a brokerage operation that is not full service. We're a full service brokerage operation at Keller. But they find one that's limited. It almost looks like it's a for sale by owner, but somebody put it in MLS. And that listing agent says, you need to contact the seller to do this, you need to do this, and they're giving you instructions when their obligation is to the seller. And so we'll talk about this form. It's a really good form. You can kind of see how you could use some of that when you work with true for sale by owners. In this case that I'm talking about, they have a listing broker. That listing broker says, I'll do it for $50. We've had them do it for $50, put it in MLS. But they still are statutorily, they are required to perform all of these functions for their sellers, but they're trying to throw it off on the buyer agent. Okay, we've got one in Dallas who is very prevalent in your marketplace, and they won't respond, they won't do anything, and the buyer agents are stuck in a really bad spot. So we'll go through that form. But we're going to have a form of the month kind of thing, flavor of the month. Okay, seller's temporary residential lease. Again, timing of when it gets attached to the contract can make all the difference in the world for your seller. This 3-day TRID regulation, you know, where nobody gets to close until the closing disclosures are approved by a buyer, and then 4 days later, it'll close, because that 3-day waiting period can never be waived. I am going to tell you I have a little bit of concern going on. We have been receiving notations that lenders do not want the agents to even look at the closing disclosure. Okay? And the reason, I told the attorney who represents the broker lawyer committee, he asked me, he said, Marilyn, how's it going? I said, let me tell you, even though we have the authorization and third party, paragraph E at the very end, they're not giving them to the agents. And the reason for this is they don't want a delay. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like, they know if you look at it, you're going to find out that somebody did not do the right appointment of prorations, or it needs to be a credit here, and such. That they don't want you to be involved. And it's interesting because for years, Trek has said, that is your job, and it is your job big time. You even have to break down the proration forms for homeowners associations on the HUD to make sure that your client wasn't overcharged. And I know this because we had an agent who was fined $5,000 by Trek because she did not do that. And so, and it was on a case study for the broker responsibility course that Trek puts out for brokers to take. So I know that Trek has always said that's our job, but now all of a sudden, the the lender really doesn't want you to do this because you might find something that would cause a delay. Let me tell you, it's going to be a delay and it's going to be for a real reason. It's not like we're just out there causing trouble. You're doing your job. So again, most of our sellers are told by the listing agent, look, they say they're going to close on April 30th. Would you like a seller's temporary residential lease? That means you're going to be allowed, you're going to sit it for a few days after closing and funding, just so that you can make sure that you're not packed up and moved out. And sometimes it works that way. Sometimes sellers say, no, I have to be at my new job on this day. I have to have it close and fund on this time. Well, as listing agents, we know that while we want it to close and fund, it's not in our control, nor is it in the seller's control. So that's why it's probably good to advise them to have a seller's temporary residential lease at the point in time before the parties even know each other. They're more willing to, kind of give and take. And a beautiful agent came up to me earlier and she said, the buyers really want this property so much that they're willing to almost let the seller, give the seller anything they want. Well, that's a golden moment because that is rare. And sometimes they say it, but they don't do it. You know what I'm saying? They dig their heels in and get out. Was there a question back there? No? Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the seller's temporary residential lease, and I'm going to break it down by the provisions that have caused the biggest problems for the agents as well as the parties that they represent. Seller's temporary residential lease. Now, paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 are important, but that's not what I'm going to go through, okay? They are very important, and basically because it says who the landlord is and who the tenant is, and who is going to be for the property and then the term. But in paragraph 4, the first problem that we get into is the rental, okay? And it says tenant shall pay the landlord as rental X number of dollars per day. Okay, so they're asking for a per diem, a per day rate, but excluding the day of closing and funding. No seller pays for the lease for the day of closing because all sellers' expenses are what? They're the day of funding. It's the seller's property, so the seller doesn't have to pay for the day of closing and funding because it's their property, okay? So we've had to have some adjustments on that when the closing date was extended and somebody didn't go back and kind of check the math. What is the per diem and how many days are we be in there? The next one is what really is the saddest. It says, with the full amount of rental for the term of the lease to be paid at the time of funding of the sale. So many times the listing agent didn't pay attention to this. They didn't say, how many days do you want the temporary lease for? I want it for 10 days, okay, and how much per day? $50. Would that come out to $500 that they have to pay this landlord at closing? Yes, okay. And sometimes it might be even in special provisions, you might want to actually put that figure in, or somewhere, so that the seller actually knows, look, on day of closing, this is what you're going to have to pay. Okay, just do the mathematical calculation rather than leaving it per diem. The next one says deposit. It says tenant shall pay the landlord at the time of funding of the sale X number of dollars as a deposit to secure performance of the lease by tenant. Landlord may use the deposit to satisfy tenant's obligations under this lease. The next paragraph comes from the statutes. In other words, what is the landlord by law obligated to? The landlord shall refund any unused portion of the deposit to tenant with an itemized list of all deductions from the deposit within 30 days after tenant A surrenders possession of the property and B provides landlord written notice of tenant's forwarding address. And what you're going to see is we're going to point out these paragraphs, and then you're going to see the acknowledgement. And it kind of touches each one of these points so they can kind of bring it back home for them and they see exactly what their duty would be and their obligations at that time.
So, give me an example, like if a landlord needs, a tenant needs 3 days to rent back, after the sale of their house. And if they give a personal check, it's probably not going to do it, or it's going to clear this time they're moving out.
the obligation. But if the tenant failed to give their forwarding address, the landlord cannot account for the security deposit. So it has to be two-pronged. They have to surrender the property, give over all their access to it and anything else, plus they have to give their forwarding address in writing. Otherwise, the landlord is not obligated. They can account for it, but they couldn't send it to anybody. And that's the issue. We have a lot of problems with that. Yeah, next thing we're going to talk about, have y'all ever seen temporary leases where the seller says, I'm not going to pay any rent? This is my house. Well, actually, as a tenant, it's not their house, but they still don't want to pay for it.
Yes.
And here's what I'm going to tell you, as prudent agents, our response to our clients would always be, we would never recommend that you pay no rent or no security deposit. Because have you ever heard of a landlord going into a lease and not having rent or security deposit? Absolutely not. That's the whole reason they have it in writing. So you see the difference. We're in a position with these temporary leases that there's something else, that other underlying factor, they're selling a property. And one party thinks they have a right to stay in their property because they sold it for so little or gave them a great deal. You know, there's all those emotional things involved. But your language will always be the same for the buyer agent as well as the listing agent. There is not a landlord that would ever have a lease without rent and security deposit. That being said, I will do what you asked me to, but bottom line is we're never going to deviate from that script, period, because that doesn't make any sense. Okay. The next paragraph that we're going to look at is paragraph 10, alterations. And we're not talking about alterations on clothing. They're saying tenant may not alter the property or install improvements or fixtures without the prior written consent of the landlord. Any improvements or fixtures placed on the property during the lease become the property of the landlord, very similar to what's in the regular lease. Here's a scenario that happened. The tenants still think they're the owners of the property. It's why they haven't moved out. They're still waking up in the same room they've been waking up in the last 20 years or whatever. So here's what happens. They go to flip on a switch and all of a sudden, the fan's not working. So it was working when they went to bed, but it doesn't right now. So the wife says to the husband, go on down to Home Depot and get another fan and we'll just put it in there. Can they do that? Absolutely not. They don't own the property. Now, because here's what we did have happen, that exact same scenario. I think they went to Lowe's though, because I saw the receipt. But anyway, my brother works at Home Depot, so I had to get him. So here's what happened. There was a stainless steel fan. Do you know how much stainless steel fans are? They're very expensive. But they went to Lowe's and they bought a different fan. Put it in the whole bit, right? Buyers on their walkthrough. They're tooling around, they walk it through. Nobody took pictures. They don't know. You know what I'm saying? It dawns on them. They're moved in, and then they wake up the next morning, and the wife was lying in bed, and she's looking up at that fan and thinking, there's something wrong here. She went back to the pictures in MLS and on the brochure. Sure enough, that fan was not what was in the property when they bought it. Much less when they walked through prior to going to closing and funding, because we had the receipts. It was not when they owned the property, it was when they were tenants of the property. And so the parties at that point, they're not reasonable at all. The buyers now, the landlords, are fit to be tied. The sellers moved out of state and they turned to the listing broker and said, you fix this, I gave you all that money. Okay. Exactly. Oh, I know. You'd be surprised what they say about some of these things. Much like when I brought the attorney from Seller Shield last month, we have a lot of sellers who turn and say, well, why do you think I gave you all that commission? You're supposed to make this go away. They have that kind of presumption thinking that they've got you forever and that whatever. You don't get paid enough for anybody to have that attitude with you. And I don't care if you sell a $5 million home. Your task and your earning ability you earn every cent and then some in the transaction. I absolutely know that for a fact. So again, just remember alterations. Paragraph 11, special provisions. We're going to talk about, I'm going to put up a slide, we're going to talk about what I recommend you adding here, okay? And part of it is to take care of this issue about the deposit and how a landlord can account for the deposit and some of the duties that these tenants now will have to do. And it's a great way for both of the agents to have it in writing so that nobody misunderstands that this is a lease between landlord and tenant and not the broker. Okay. The next paragraph that absolutely nobody read, but don't feel badly about this. We've had 2 attorneys involved and 2 of them that were actual agents. One of them represented a seller and as a tenant, and one represented a buyer agent. And it's really funny. Both of them argued with me. I said, can we just read paragraph 12 together? And it says, landlord may enter at reasonable times to inspect the property. Tenant shall provide landlord door keys and access codes to allow access to the property during the term of the lease. And the attorney representing the seller says, we're not giving them access. I said, well, it's not their property. It's the buyer's property. And once he read that, he said, okay, he stood up in a team meeting right after that. He said, okay, we're one hat only, that of a realtor. He was trying to wear his attorney hat. He thought that he could bluff the other party into thinking, well, the other party didn't even read paragraph 12 either. I had to read it to the other agent too. But what it came down to is they were thinking that they didn't have to give access, but every landlord has to have access to the property. No tenant could change the codes or the door during the term of the lease without turning over access to the landlord. That's part of the reason they have to get permission. The landlord has to know how to get into their own property. So again, this is important. What does it say? It says give all the door keys and any access codes prior to funding, closing and funding. Okay, so we'll talk about how we can deal with that. The next paragraph that is deadly is repairs and maintenance. Okay, TREC has the mindset that while they allow the temporary leases to be attached to the contract, they absolutely don't want any buyer to not have that property in the same condition as it would be on the day of closing and funding, okay? And that's the reason that this next provision comes in here. The tenant and the landlord, they were buyer and seller, and they agreed to add these temporary leases. But TREC says, no, that landlord is entitled, as an owner of the property and a buyer, to have that property in the exact same condition or better than at time of closing. And a lot of times tenants, as the former sellers, don't care about that, do they? No, because on one hand, they act like they're still the property, but then if anything happens to it, they're going to run away from it. And it says, except as otherwise provided in this lease, tenant shall bear all expense of repairing and maintaining the property, including but not limited to the yard, trees, and shrubs, unless otherwise required by the Texas Property Code. Now, the Texas Property Code's only exclusions are 18D1 of our lease, and it says for water penetration, for HVAC system, or for water heaters, unless caused by the tenant, okay? No tenant is obligated to do that, okay, unless caused by the tenant. Now, what I am going to tell you, it says in the little next to it, says tenant shall promptly repair at tenant's expense any damage to the property caused directly or indirectly by any act of omission of the tenant or any person other than the landlord, landlord's agents, or invitees. Let me tell you what happened. During the course of the contract, the buyers had the property inspected. They had an HVAC guy come in, okay? And the buyer and seller negotiated that the HVAC, even though it was kind of like on its last journey of life, kind of, but it was still being able to be repaired, would be repaired to the liking of the buyer. The buyer agreed to that, right? Residential service contract was placed on the property in paragraph 7, okay? It was paid for closing. Well, what happened is while the tenants were in the property, the HVAC went out. They immediately called their listing agent. See, they suck you right away. And they said, contact the other agent and ask, how do we report the residential service claim for what we gave the buyer at closing and funding? Well, unfortunately for these sellers who are now tenants, the buyer on the other side, the landlord, is actually an attorney. Things could not get better. So what happened is the buyer agent contacted their client and said, we just got to, they know where to contact me. I gave them all my contact details. I'm the landlord. I'm not putting in any claim. I'm not living in the property. I'm not going to do it. We had one decline because one of these, you have to read these residential service contracts, the small print, it will not extend to a tenant. Okay, and that's what happened. We had it happen before. The tenant was there at the property and they're going, no, this is so-and-so. No, well, we're their tenant. Zip, HVAC person left. Okay, but this buyer, who is the now landlord, he told him, he said, I'm not putting in a claim and you're gonna have to repair it. Well, guess what? The HVAC, same HVAC guy came out. Guess what? It could not be repaired.
Oh.
$7,000 to replace it.
And the tenant had to pay.
Yep.
The tenant.
Mainly because the landlord, it was an attorney. And it had been working in good order at the time of closing and funding. The caveat was the landlord, I don't know how they knew that. I think they were just being their typical selves about contracts. But what happened is the HVAC person went out and it had frozen. Well, they had the doors open a lot. They were moving things in and out, and somebody went over and flipped that thermostat down and froze the unit. And that was caused by the tenant. Oh, I know. Let me tell you, they threatened. No, the previous seller got. Oh my gosh, they were going to just hang, drawn, and quarter the listing agent and the broker because you got me into this and how dare you, all this kind of stuff. Bottom line is they had to pay it. Mainly because the other party, the landlord, they had free legal aid. I don't know about you, that would be a problem for me if I had a lawyer on the other side that says I can take care of this myself, and you have to pay somebody $2.50 an hour to take care of it.
In the event that it would have been the tenant's fault and it just so happened.
Well, the problem would be the landlord and tenant would have to come to an agreement on that. If the tenant could prove that they had not caused the item to go into disrepair or not being able to be repaired, there is a provision in the Texas Property Code. And so it really took down to the minutia to find out that it was caused by the tenant. And again, the HVAC guy, he wasn't going to lie for anybody, even though he'd maintained that system for a long time. The worst part is we found invoices that had gone back 3 years before that said it needed to be replaced. You know, that they kept trying to patch it and kind of fix it. So even though the buyer and seller had agreed during the contract to repair it and get it back working, it was really on its last leg. But again, you see how these things come up, and the first call is to their agent and want to just suck you back into it and make you responsible for it. And I'll be honest, nobody has ever read any of this. The purpose was the sellers just needed more time to stay in the property because they weren't sure when it was going to close. They wanted that provision, and everybody just sent it through digitally and said, sign here, and we'll make it a part of the contract. Nobody read it. Nobody reviewed it with their client. Even the agents didn't know, and especially even agents who are attorneys did not know. So don't feel badly. It's not that I'm making fun of you or bringing a light that you don't read, but people don't read. And some people read and then they think they understand it, but then when it gets interpreted by an attorney, it gets changed or morphed from what we know it to be. I'm not saying that every attorney is right either. We've had a lot of them who are not real estate attorneys that their client has hired because it's either a divorce attorney or a probate attorney, somebody who's assisting with it, and they give their interpretation, and that's based on contract law interpretation, not our actual documents that we use, because we've got a lot of nuances in our contracts to give privilege to the consumer. The next paragraph is indemnity. It says tenant indemnifies landlord from the claims of all third parties for injury or damage to the person or property of such third party arising from the use of occupancy of the property by tenant. This indemnification includes attorney's fees, costs, and expenses incurred by the landlord. Let me tell you about this one. Last year, about this time, a listing agent got an offer from a buyer agent. The sellers wanted to stay on the property through graduation. They had a daughter graduating and they were going to be leaving the area, and they wanted to really give a great send-off for her. You know, she's going to leave all her childhood friends and that. So anyway, the parties agreed to come to a decision that there would be this temporary lease. The buyer agent, evidently the buyer, who is now the landlord, found out, I think through Facebook or some social media, that they were planning this huge shindig in May. Now, mind you, they had a temporary lease till the end of May. And ring-a-ding-a-dingy, the phone rings, the buyer agent picks up, and they're going, oh my gosh, they're planning a huge party at the house. I will not allow that. And they're the landlord. Can those tenants have that big party?
No.
Oh no. And the worst part was, while the buyer agent got out of the fracas real early, because she doesn't know the sellers, she wasn't invited to the party. But guess who was invited to the party? The listing agent. They're like this with the sellers. She knew about it. And the buyers, as landlords, claimed that this listing agent withheld material information and gave bad advice to the sellers that they could, in fact, even have this function. So the landlord was really smart, because once we told him this is an issue between landlord and tenant, we did it as nice as possible. He understood. He said, okay, I'll get in touch with him. They had to actually have a host liquor liability. They had to, they were given 2 days after the takedown of the big tent and thing. The landlord was going to come through, and if any shrubs were damaged or any sod was misplaced and all that, the landlord had a provision that the tenant will take all responsibility. They also had a policy on it for the GL, in other words, the liability portion for a tenant, because they were hosting an event. And in the event that somebody fell in the pool or something, the tenant was going to absorb all of the risk of that through this policy. But the landlord was really good, told them exactly the insurance they wanted, the limits they wanted, the tenants agreed to it, and we never heard anything back. So, you know, that's been a year, so I usually know that everything's okay, especially when we were pulled into it from the very beginning. But the interesting part is the listing agent said, well, I don't think it had anything to do with me knowing it. Well, it did. You know that if they're planning this event, you would have gotten agreement at that time that the temporary lease was put on there, and then a notice to the landlord that the tenant is going to be hosting a graduation party for their daughter on this day between these hours, that kind of thing. And then let them negotiate that. It might have resulted that the closing didn't occur until when? The end of May. It could have been. And that lock may have been paid by the seller just so that they could facilitate this and still own the property. How many of you think buyers would love the idea that they have a home under contract and there's going to be a big party? You know, and I don't know in what world, but I don't think it will ever work out. You know what I'm saying? That's just something that's kind of pushing the limits. Believe it or not, I represented a buyer who, this was before it was in our contracts. Sometimes I think they added it because of me. It said that the property can be continued to be marketed through the day of closing by the seller. They have a right to do that. In other words, they can continue to show that property and get backup contracts through the day of closing. But if your buyer wants to not allow the seller to do that, because this buyer didn't want anybody walking through their house. It wasn't their house, they just had it under contract, but you know how buyers are. And so, in an amendment to the contract, the sellers agreed to remove it from marketing the property. But they had to be proven that these buyers actually were going to close. Do you know what I'm saying? That the seller wasn't gonna just take it off the market and not have any more showings. They wanted some assurance that the buyer was gonna be able to close and fund. But we've seen those kind of things. People get a little upset about people coming into their property when it's not even their property yet. But you understand, because the seller, literally, once they're under contract, while they may physically still be the owner and they're living there, this kind of suspends it. It becomes like a bubble. That home has to be in the same condition or better at the time of execution, all the way down. And with that being said, I got a call on my way over here. Buyer's doing final walkthrough. This year alone, I have had 5 instances where the buyer agent calls me and they said, we did the walkthrough and there's a leak under the kitchen sink. And I'm thinking, you know, I don't know if this is real or not, because when you have that many, you're thinking, what's going on? And she said, the listing agent is saying that it's not their issue. I said, well, it is their issue, and I'll tell you why. It is the owner's property until the day of closing and funding. And that's a material fact about the property now. It's got a leak. The inspector couldn't have gotten it 3 weeks ago because it is happening right now. No seller can hide that. The seller has to fix it and repair it to the liking of the buyer. Otherwise, the buyer has a material issue that's come up that could say, hey, you either fix this the right way and I have somebody sign off on it that you did the right thing, or I'm not going to accept your property. It's the same thing. It's almost like that constant bit of the moment you find out about something, the other party has to be told. Then the party's going to have to reach agreement, how it's going to be taken care of, put it in writing, and you go forward. But here, do me a favor. On your next walkthrough, tell your buyer to open up underneath the kitchen. Because the ones that we had the issues on didn't do that through the walkthrough. They did it after they closed and funded. They were moving things in, and they found it. And one of them, this is the worst part, one of them found at the baseboard of the cabinet, they found a piece of wood. They sent me pictures because they know I love pictures. Of a piece of wood that had been screwed and drilled in to the deck of the cabinet. What do you think the buyer in their new home did? They unscrewed it. That would be what my guys would do. They'd unscrew it and they found rotted wood and black mold. Oh. I saw pictures of that too. And I don't know about you, but if you drill and screw down something, what are you trying to do? Something. And the interesting part, the poor inspector said, well, it wasn't visible at the time of inspection and everything was dry. So it wasn't brought to his attention, you know, that there's a screw plate on top of, you know, the base. You know, sometimes inspectors are just human. It didn't bring it to anybody's attention. And it was because it was dry, most likely, right? Or could have had, you know, I don't know, the contact paper over it, you know, so that no leaks would go through and stuff like that. But sometimes it just takes these little things that seem so little and so nonsensical, and then it turned into a huge thing, because once you find out somebody did try to conceal something. And what's interesting is the seller said, oh my gosh, that happened like the first couple of years that we lived here. They lived there 20 years. Oh, wow. I could see where the seller would forget that they had some hole or something and they fixed it. It evidently wasn't waterproof. And something must have happened on that. Okay, next paragraph is 16. The biggest thing is possession of the property by seller as tenant may change insurance policy coverage. Tenants have tenant renter's insurance, what we call tenant insurance. They no longer have homeowner's insurance. That's what the buyer, who is now the landlord and owner of the property, has. So just be aware that it's a whole different thing. Their contents are the only things that will be covered if they do in fact have renter's insurance. Otherwise, if the house burned down and all their contents were burned, they would have no coverage. And the landlord is not gonna cover anything of the tenant, okay, so just be aware of that. Number 17, default. If tenant fails to perform or observe any provision of this lease and fails within 24 hours after notice by landlord to commence and diligently pursue to remedy such failure, tenant will be in default. Here's what we're gonna talk about. They had all those darn attorneys involved and it went on for weeks. In November of last year, at the end of the month, there was an executed contract. It was submitted into compliance. In compliance, it had that the closing day was gonna be in December, about mid-December, and the sellers had a temporary lease until February 29th. It was an FHA loan. Y'all think anything's wrong with that? Yeah, if you can't close in the middle of December and have a tenant stay in the property until the end of February. First off, the FHA guidelines and VA guidelines are very strict, and what it says is that those owners of the property must be in the property by the first payment, when the first payment is due. That's kind of a rule of thumb. The buyer agent did not use my checklist that I provided last August for everybody to use because it talks about that. So what happened, the parties had to go back and do an amendment. They had a seller's temporary residential lease, to cover that very long staying afterwards. And so then they had to do a new temporary lease. What happened on that was the original temporary lease, the seller's temporary lease, had a provision that was pretty punitive if the tenant stayed past the last day of that lease, okay? We call it a holdover, it's in paragraph 19. And the agent had been through enough of my training that I said you have to make it punitive. In other words, it has to be painful. I've seen $1,000, I saw one that had $5,000 on it. Because what they found out is that they had performances that had to happen and they wanted to make sure that tenant was not going to be a tenant in sufferance. Okay, nobody gets to stay after that day. Okay. In this instance, at closing everything went well, and at closing the buyer and seller were very cordial to each other, and they said, "Oh, our new to be built will be done. We're supposed to move in February 15th." Okay, so they closed at the end of December. They had a lease, a temporary lease per the landlord's permission that it could go until February 19th. Okay. Well, all of a sudden, they've been in this lease for almost 40 days or 35 days, and it gets passed back to the buyers, first-time home buyers that are landlords. Oh no, the new construction won't be ready until the 29th. The exact same time that it was the year before when they were doing the offer. So the listing agent sent over scathing emails. No, we have it in an email that everybody gets to stay, your buyers were fine with it, the sellers are not moving out. Well, they're not sellers, they're tenants. And she was an attorney and she drafted a horrendous letter going back to the landlord that says, you don't get to get into your property. We're staying as long as we want. And the holdover rate had changed dramatically from the original temporary lease to this one. And that was because the buyer and the buyer agent had made terms that were agreeable to the sellers, and then once it changed, when they found out FHA that wasn't going to float, they came back and they had a point of weakness, the buyer did at that point. The buyer had to agree to things, otherwise this was not going to work. And you can't change something this significant on a seller without a seller agreeing to it. You can't do it just unilaterally. It's got to be mutual. And there was no way that this seller at that point in time didn't feel like they're in the driver's seat. The problem was the sellers had thought that their property would be ready. It wasn't. There was a delay, but they wouldn't leave the property. This is the one where the sheriff was called out twice on this. The problem is that they can never extend this temporary lease without the landlord and tenant agreeing to it in writing. It's kind of one of those drop dead dates. It's done. And the interesting part is, after much conversation with the buyer who was so highly distressed that his life was just ruined by this. One instance, he was a first-time home buyer. I told him, I said, we're not lawyers. I said, well, we have tried to facilitate. Obviously, we're getting pushback. We cannot get the other party to do anything, and we're not a part of this lease. It really is between you. You're going to have to hire an attorney. So they had a prepaid legal attorney who drafted a letter that would not have scared anybody. You know what I'm saying? And I read legal letters all the time and briefs. You know what I'm saying? Some of them scare me and some of them don't. And this was not one of those. And I told him, I said, you really need to hire from this list of attorneys, the real estate attorneys here in the Houston area. And I think they're going to put more teeth into what they're going to convey to the tenant. Well, no, he didn't do that. Then they decided to rip Keller Williams up and tear them up and say how horrible for you. You allowed us to negotiate with the seller at a reduced rate for this whole kind of thing. It went on, as I said, our attorney was involved. Everybody had an attorney. But the problem is that the agent was telling these tenants, you can stay. Just pay that holdover rate. So be very careful they're not. If they breach this lease, man, the provisions, and I'll be real honest, they're going to go after it. They're doing a truck complaint against the listing agent, TAR complaints, and they're going to take them to civil court. They have a lot of damages. I know, I saw all of it. They had to stay and they had to be out of this one apartment by day. It was just disastrous. You know what I'm saying? The buyer had problems because they were not able to get into the property. So again, it was devastating, but that's what default means. It means you have to be out on that last day of this lease period unless you have it in writing. Yes?
When was the buyer landlord's first payment due?
It was due the 1st of February. They give you a line of ability, like after 17 days, it'll be considered late. And that's what the lender, we made the lender come up with the actual date because we didn't want to be responsible for it. And the lender said, well, the first payment's not considered late until this day. And the interesting thing on the aside on this, the first mortgage payment, what address do you think it went to? Of course. And guess what the tenant did with it? Next paragraph is termination. So this lease terminates upon expiration of the term specified in paragraph 3 or upon tenant's default under this lease. It's one or the other. Either they agree to extend it in writing or that tenant is in default. One or the other. It's very, very black and white here. The next paragraph, 19, this is the holdover. This is what you never leave blank, and as I said, it better be a number that is so punitive that nobody would ever be a tenant that stays over past their lease. And it says, tenant shall surrender possession of the property upon termination of this lease. Any possession by tenant after the termination creates a tenancy at sufferance and will not operate to renew or extend this lease. Tenant shall pay blank number of dollars per day during the period of any possession after termination as damages in addition to any other remedies to which the landlord is entitled. So, if there had been $1,000, they originally had $200. It went to $50 with the second one. And the buyer agent is such just like all of y'all, just a wonderful agent, did everything they could. Never saw this coming. Really, she said, I can't believe this. I just never thought that the other agent would have even responded to us that way. The worst part, it was a Keller Williams operation, and I worked for them too. Yeah, my life was wonderful. But bottom line, what it came down to is the broker for the one operation, he says, no, Marilyn, I'm going to call the team leader, just like Veronica gets those calls. And I'm going to tell you, Veronica, even though she's going to fight tooth and nail for you based on what you should or should not have done, her demeanor is never going to be caustic, accusatory. She is into resolution. Make no mistake. She never errs on the side of not doing the right thing. So y'all can all be very blessed because that's not always the case. Because what happened is when the broker called the other team leader says, good luck on that one. Yeah, That's usually not the response we get. But I think what happened is because these tenants, these former sellers, had an agent who was an attorney, they really felt very strongly that she was gonna go to bat for them in this case. So, anyway, it's one of those situations. There better be a big dollar amount. You know how many of them I see blank? 0. Rent 0, deposit 0. No, let's do a better job. Yes, ma'am.
What would you like us to recommend? Did you say 1,000? What
You
was
know
your?
what, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It sends a clear signal.
Yes.
And if your buyer wants to send that signal, the only way they're gonna get that signal sent is if it's something that is outrageous, okay? And
I know.
Oh,
Right.
and this is not the real form. This, I modified it so that I can highlight it. If you read on the top of it, it says, this is not an official copy, template for training purposes only, because there's some things I can only do in certain software, and I didn't wanna, I just wanted it done. Now, I am gonna tell you about this. We had a buyer who said, no, I have contractors lined up, I've paid all this money, we have to get the demolition, I've got permits, we have to get it going at this point, otherwise we're not gonna meet the deadlines anyway. So the buyer agent called me and they said the buyer wants to put $1,000. I said, well, why couldn't he put $5,000? $10,000 in there. Oh, okay, we can do it. And he did it, and the buyer did it. No problem. Those tenants did not stay over, they left early, and they said, you don't have to reimburse, that kind of thing. So, you know, sometimes it sends a clear signal, and it's better that it comes from the client you represent. Just don't leave it blank. And it says, it pops off the page when there's a big figure. $50? Okay. The interesting part is the tenant sent the $50 for each day that they were gonna stay after. And the buyer agent called me again for the 18th gazillionth time and said, the buyer wants to know, should they cash it? I said, look, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm gonna tell you, if he cashes it, he's accepted it. He didn't do what I told him to get the fired up attorney after him, so I said, they did not cash it. And the other co-buyer waived that check at the walkthrough of the property after the tenants had already left and the police had been called out the day before, that kind of thing. She waived that check. She said, we didn't cash it for a reason, because we're gonna make it, we're bringing everybody down. And our attorney, who is absolutely, he is much into mediation. Let's put it to you this way. And for attorneys that are litigators, that's usually not their focus is suing and doing. But he's a great mediator. And he got off the phone, called me, and he said, oh my gosh, she's not a little upset with Keller Williams. He said, she's a lot upset. He said, I don't even know if I can get her calmed down. And I thought, well, good. I'm glad he said that, because the broker's already talked to him, the buyer agent had been talking to him, and I knew exactly that there was no comforting him. And the attorney stayed in there with him, and then he followed up with him 2 weeks later, you know, after the dust kind of settled, hoping that maybe they pulled off. Not the case. Now, what happens on these provisions that I brought out is, for the agents, especially new agents who didn't even know about this form or how to use this form, you're going to be hard to have a script that's really going to be good for you to explain to your clients, the sellers, prior to it being attached to your buyers. And so what I did is I created some little acknowledgement forms. Now, if you look at let's look at the one that says seller's acknowledgement of seller's temporary residential lease. Does everybody see that one? Okay.
If you don't have one, raise your hand so we can make sure you get you a copy. How many copies do we need? 3? Okay.
It's on the back side.
Oh, okay.
How many of you don't have a copy?
We'll get you a copy. How many copies do we need? 2?
1, 2, 3.
3?
Yeah, you took the whole thing out. It's on the back of one of them.
Make sure you have it. They're front and back. Yeah.
We're
Looks like
gonna
we
go
only
through
need
the
2.
seller's acknowledgement. Okay, we got a question. The buyer agent has the biggest job here, because it starts with the buyer. And so the buyer's gonna find out, you're gonna ask the buyer, you need to get with your lender and find out how much it costs you for taxes, insurance, and everything per day. And that's a good starting point. And as I said, I've seen zero, but it kind of makes me a little concerned, you know what I'm saying? And no security deposit, but it's between the buyer and the seller at this point, yes.
The deposit amount is the same.
It's the same thing. I am seeing a lot more. I used to see like 250, but after I've been bringing it to everybody's attention, they're adding like 1 month's rent as a security deposit, kind of, or if they're staying only 2 weeks, they did half a month's rent. So it's kind of commensurate with the length of time that the tenant is going to stay in the property. And again, it's because we don't really, the zero stuff is bad for the agents. They're gonna say that, you know, you advised them, and you're gonna have to show proof. No, I told you that you should do this. You know what I'm saying? I asked you to get all these numbers. Yes, sir.
This has as much coverage as much of the payment, interest, taxes,
Absolutely,
everything, minimum,
yeah.
at minimum.
At minimum,
Per day.
per day. That would be the base.
Minimum.
You know, because I've seen some that are $25 a day, and I know that's not the case. I've seen zero on multi-million-dollar properties. You know, they all have lawyers already, so I'm already nervous, you know? And they all know real estate really well typically. I don't care if you put this in an email, but I want on every file that has a seller's temporary residential lease attached. I even want, if you're working as a buyer's agent, you're gonna add the buyer's acknowledgement. As a listing agent, you're gonna have the seller's acknowledgement. You can either upload the email where they responded and they said, I understand. I want you to have proof that you brought these items to their attention and that it was their decision, but you gave good, sound advice. And it puts it back on them instead of on you, and that's the biggest thing. It says, since you have requested the buyer agree to the seller's temporary residential lease on the contract for the above listed property, we need to provide clarification of your duty as a tenant. Number one, this lease will, while a temporary lease is good for only the time allowed by the buyer's lender or less than 90 days with a cash transaction. Says so at the very top of the form. It cannot be used for more than 90 days. But I know that the lender determined this for the buyer. Okay, that's the big thing. So if a seller and a buyer agree to something on a Sunday and execute a contract, and then on Monday they talk to the lender and find out it's different, it's not going to be news to the seller. The seller already knew that it's going to be dictated by the lender. The next thing it says, there can be no holdover after the termination date, otherwise there will be a tenancy at sufferance, paragraph 19 situation. I'm telling them clearly, you don't get to stay in the property after termination. That's going to be your provision right now, because you're not going to be a part of it once it funds and closes. The next paragraph says this lease will be between you, the tenant, and the landlord only. Reference chapter 92 of the Texas Property Code and read the temporary lease carefully to know your full responsibility as a tenant. Keller Williams will not be a part of any facilitation assisting with your lease after the property closes and funds. We are not allowed to interfere in your agreement with the landlord, it says tenant. You will communicate in writing with the landlord. Okay, we're covering those particular paragraphs of the temporary lease and bringing it to their attention. But more importantly, you're not going to be around. You're not going to be the first call. Okay? It's their job to work it out. They're a tenant. They have to work it out directly with the landlord. Next paragraph. Make sure that you provide all the checks for rent and security deposit at closing directly to the buyer landlord. You must provide the landlord keys and any security access to your property, paragraph 12 of the seller's temporary residential lease. Do this at the same time you provide the checks. Get phone numbers and email addresses for communications. It's supposed to be on the temporary lease, but we know that y'all don't complete them, so it could have been blank. So just make sure they know that they need to do that exchange. Next is include this in the seller's temporary residential lease, a date and time that you will surrender the property to the landlord. Provide your forwarding address in writing so that the landlord can account for your deposit. Let's go back to the temporary lease. We're going to look at paragraph 11, special provisions. and you're gonna say, landlord and tenant will meet on such a date at such a time for surrender of property. That's what you're going to always place in special provisions. Landlord and tenant will meet on March 21st at 5 p.m. for surrender of property. And the reason for that is all the dates in our contract, unless specifically stated, like paragraph 23 now is 5 p.m., they really expire at 11:59 p.m. Well, I don't know about you, but very few landlords want to take their property at 11:59 p.m. and do some kind of walkthrough and surrender. And so that's going to be added in every one of the provisions. Does it say that the Keller Williams buyer agent's going to be there or the Keller Williams listing agent?
No.
No, that's why I want it very clear that the landlord and tenant, you're not to be anywhere around. In this scenario that we just talked about, that devastating issue, on the day after the surrender, they asked for the buyer agent to go. And I told the broker and the agent, I said, my advice to you is no. But I understand you feel really badly, but you cannot go along because this woman was too combative and too threatening. And you know, I get fearful that there could be something that could happen, and then the agent would be. So her husband was a license holder as well, and so he went with her. She texted me when she was there, and of the update, and gave me a picture of, you know, that they were all okay and everything. And it does worry me. I'm going to tell you right now, when you show property, you better only be in the property during your appointed time. Not 1 minute later. Not 1 minute later. I don't want to run the risk of somebody. We've had a shooting where a seller heard the alarm go off, and in her house, when she came down from the upstairs, there were these people in her home. It was the agent, the agent husband, who happened to be the best friend of the buyer, and the agent's husband was shot. Fortunately, he survived. But that was one of those things. They were 45 minutes after their appointed time. Yeah, it was pretty bad. Of course, CSS. Everything is recorded, so we had her, of course, she never called and rescheduled and got permission. I mean, she said she thought it was vacant, and I'm thinking with the pictures on the house with all the property furniture, I don't know how anybody would think it was vacant. You know what I'm saying? It didn't look vacant, and there was nothing on the MLS that said it was vacant, and I don't care if it is vacant. Don't do it. You know what I'm saying? It was almost like her defense was not a defense at all. So again, just for your safety, I don't want y'all to be injured, and so just don't ever go into a property without permission to be there. As I said, this landlord and tenant will meet for surrender. Well, your first-time home buyer who's a landlord, well, what should I do? Well, I think I would inspect the properties just like you want to inspect it prior to closing and funding. So that landlord, while he's got a landlord hat on, he's really the first time he's going to occupy his home or her home. So you want to make sure that they know, go through every cabinet, check under the kitchen sink, you know, make sure that the property is what you're willing to accept. If not, they're going to have a conversation. Every good property manager who has been at the surrender with the tenant, they inspect it. The tenants, we tell them, take pictures of the condition of the property upon surrender, who's there that you surrendered the property to. Every good property manager that does that, they usually convey to the tenant, you'll know, are they pleased with the condition of the property, or are they thinking this isn't going to work? You know what I'm saying? They're humans. They have that reflection when they see the condition of the property. But you're not going to be there. That's not your job. I know you want to help them and you want to be friends for life, but you have no reason to be there. If you are there and something goes down, you were there as a guest of the landlord, but there's no reason for you, from a real estate perspective, to be there. Yes, ma'am.
I had a deal, and I'd love your advice on it too, where my seller was staying from a temporary back. And so the buyer's agent said, my buyer's going to walk through a certain time day. I'm going to be with him. Are you going to be there too? I said, yes, I'll be there. So I met my seller, I know. I'm learning every day. So I met my seller there, and the buyer and the buyer's agent came. Well, they went through the house with a fine tooth comb, and, found where he had scraped the master bedroom door by taking out their big furniture and all that kind of stuff. So she approaches me and says that the buyer would like the seller to pay an additional $250 in damages. And then there was something else, I don't remember what it was, that the seller or the buyer was gonna do. Anyhow, the buyer and seller negotiated, and my seller did pay a little bit more for damages because he had damage, and rather than repair it, he was willing to write the check. But, she came to me for that negotiation, and I'm just concerned if the buyer and seller were there without agents.
They'd be talking to each other.
I know. Well, what if the buyer's agent says, I'm going as a seller's agent, and I mean, you're
And
saying
you
I
say
should
you're
go.
not.
Yeah,
When you say I'm not.
you say I'm not.
Yeah, just say, unfortunately, this transaction is closed and funded. We no longer have a reason to be there. So, I am erring on the side of proof. My tenants absolutely know that they're tenants and that I'm not a part of this lease. I'm so sorry, I won't be there. Yeah. And it's gonna feel bad for the tenant because see, they've got somebody ganging up on them. But bottom line is, this is between a landlord and tenant. And you know what's so funny is, at that point, when the two agents said, we'll do this, that is so bizarre considering the landlord and tenant are right there. You see, their perception is, their expectation was, you're gonna take care of this. You got me into this, you get me out.
I think if we start making sure that we explain this up front, during negotiation, if they want that lease back, I think it'll kind of deter them.
I think so too, and I'll be honest, if on your side and the other agent is the buyer agent or whatever, saying, you know what, this is not for your use, but I'm gonna tell you that we have a form that we use when we review with them. Please review these items with your buyer/landlord to be. And while they can't use our forms, because they're our forms, it's a great opportunity to say, you need to come on over to Keller Williams and talk to Veronica, because we got these handy dandy forms that can kind of help you. And my thing is that I think many times, just like, you're an experienced agent, but we get pulled into these positions, and for us to say no, you are anti-no. You're, okay, I'll do that. That is what you say every time. You never, ever say, oh, I can't do that. Oh, I'll do that. Sure, let me make that repair for you. I know how you are, and my problem is that if you are not an individual that can clearly set down the rules, I'm just gonna tell you, I had a team, and the people on my team, what is now, she's my sister-in-law, but the people on my team, one of them was a very good agent. She's a great agent. But I've told you about her before. She's one of those sirens. This is where she can have all the ships against the rocks and crash, because Barbara has this voice. It's so, oh my Lord, I mean, it just sucks people in. They'll do whatever she says. So anyway, me on the other hand, they don't even ask. It was so different. They would ask Barbara, can you feed the cats and dogs and take care of them and water the plants while we go away this weekend? She had the listing agent. I look at her, I go, you are not doing that. Oh, it's okay, Meryl. I said, it is not okay. You're going to call me, and the cat's going to get out of the dog, and then I'm going to be the one coming over to help you out, and all this. And the reason I said it, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law had a house sitter in California. Their dog did get out. He was a beautiful Rusty. He was a Bismarck. Got out. 5-car pileup. People died. They were in a lawsuit in California for 5 years. They couldn't even buy a home. So, and it was the dog sitter who let the dog out. So after that, you know what I'm telling you? And with my sister-in-law and all the animals, she's also the agent who sends out an email and says, well, we had a closing today, and the sellers didn't take their animals. I thought, oh my God, those animals are at my brother's house. Oh yeah, they're there. They're still there. They're not there. And so anyway, I knew then that he was going to come home from Home Depot, and there were going to be more critters than when he left that morning. But we do. We don't say no. We don't. We just are too giving. That's why I'm saying, I want you to share, because sometimes the agent's on the other side, it's not like you're trying to influence how they work with their client. You're just gonna say, I'm just gonna say, we are proactive. We wanna make sure that these issues that can occur from time to time on these temporary leases, let me just share with you kind of how we approach it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, even though you just said that to your buyer, landlord, client, but should you also say, should you just go as far as saying, look, once this is closed and funded, I'm out of this, so if you have any issues about this lease, you better, make sure you have an attorney or something. I mean,
Well, and basically, most of these, you're just gonna get in with the landlord, and it says very clearly, Keller Williams will not be a part of any facilitation assisting with your lease after the property closes and funds. We're not allowed to enter in your agreement. You will communicate in writing with the landlord. Very clearly.
Where's that at?
That
Where's
is
that?
exactly what I did.
Third paragraph?
Yes.
Okay. And are these acknowledgements are actually in Dudley? Do you have them in Dudley?
I'm gonna get Nicole to add them.
Oh, good, 'cause I was gonna
This
say I haven't
weekend.
seen these yet,
Um,
but I love them.
Right, and the reason for that is that, as I said, it's so hard for us to say that to our clients because, again, of the situation. The next one is, it says, read this carefully. Again, you are fully responsible for the condition of the property and any and all repairs, okay? Now, again, there are those exceptions, but for the most part, they're gonna have to repair everything. And you know what's interesting? Last weekend, I had an agent call and they said, it includes the shrubs, doesn't it? I said, did you read paragraph 14? They said, I did after the email you sent me. I read it, and you're right, it includes shrubs. I said, absolutely. Those tenants have to water the property, they have to take care of all those shrubs, and in other words, it has to look that or better on the day of closing and funding. So again, it's real important that they understand the issues. They can't make any of the repairs by themselves. They have to contact their landlord. It's just like a regular lease in that respect. But I want to make sure they understand that it's not that they can't have this. I just want them to know their duty and obligations and that you won't be a part of it, okay? Now, the next one that we're going to do, I did mention about repairs. You break, you pay unless an act of God. Did any of y'all have hail damage on Friday? Well, Friday night, a storm came through my part. I think it was going east. It was coming here. And we had a hailstorm. It didn't get to y'all? Oh, yeah. Well, Friday night, it was pretty bad, and people who had never had hail, ever, had hail. And of course, everybody's smiling and thinking, okay, well, this will be great. All the adjusters, I'm sure, are out there today because the rain had stopped and all that. We didn't have very much rain where I live in Bernie because I'm in a vortex. It's like the Bermuda Triangle. We never get rain. It can rain across the street, but if we're at 109, and I kept opening the door and going out on the patio. My husband kept saying, what do you think you're going to find? I want that rain. And it was raining out the front at our neighbors, but it wasn't raining out back there. Wow. It's okay, we beat the Warriors on Saturday night. So again, an act of God is different. That would be a homeowner's responsibility for any act of God. So a tenant's not responsible for that. Don't let you think that it's the four walls they have to take care of and the roof and all that. It's just really the condition of the property on that. Now, the buyers and the seller's temporary risk insurance. Let's look at the other side of this. Okay. Now, a buyer is in a position of being a landlord. And as I said, I think the worst thing for us is that these poor first-time homeowners have to actually have another title called landlord. You can imagine as a buyer's agent a nightmare for you. Because you're going to tell them to reach after 92 and they're going to say, what? You told me that the sellers needed to stay a few days. Why am I a landlord? They're concerning. And so they're going to really lean heavily on you. And again, as I said, we're gonna always do the right thing by them, but they have to understand there's some things that they need to be willing to accept as well. It says seller has requested buyer agree to seller's temporary residential lease on the contract for the above listed property. While you certainly can make any decision you want, there are several issues that you must be willing to accept in allowing this to be a part of your contract. And that's really almost everything in our contract is the same way. We go to our buyers or our sellers, we give them options. Then they have to what? Make that decision. How many of you have ever had clients who said, you make the decision? I would tell them, don't buy this property. Oh, but we really want the property. Then you don't want my advice. Because I just told you not to buy it and I'll have to spend 3 weeks figuring out the repairs. But anyway, the first paragraph. This lease, while a temporary lease, is good for only the time allowed by your lender or less than 90 days of a cash transaction. Make sure you have verified in writing prior to agreeing that your lender has approved the temporary lease and for the number of days the seller is requesting for the term of the lease. That's what I put on that buyer checklist. It's really scary for me as an agent. I know how on the weekend people said, oh, I want to buy it. And you're going, what, your lender won't call us back. You know what I'm saying? That's why I get all these answers up front, as many as you can from the lender. At least the lender will say, well, in this scenario, we would allow this. In this one, we wouldn't. You know what I'm saying? You can have scenarios without them feeling that they're committed to something. But at least your buyer will know. The next paragraph, it says, this lease will be between you, the landlord, and the tenant only. Reference Chapter 92 of the Texas Property Code and read the temporary lease carefully to know your full responsibility as a landlord. Keller Williams will not be a part of any facilitation assisting with your lease after the property closes in funds. We are not allowed to interfere in your agreement with the tenant. And that's a fact. I mean, that's a law. And the attorneys all behind us at $1,000,000%. They said, Marilyn, you don't have any business being here. And the worst part was when we had this one dispute, I found out that the agent, after this closed and funded and was heavily involved in this dispute on this temporary lease, they'd have no E&O coverage. I don't know about you, but that made me be real quiet. Goodbye, I'm not going to be there. You know what I'm saying? I'm not going to put myself or in harm's position when they're not going to think I had any reason to be there. The next thing is make sure that you negotiate for rent and security deposit. Remember, this is the buyer perspective. They're going to be the landlord. The other one was the tenant, the seller. We're not going to tell a buyer that they shouldn't get rent and security deposit. But that negotiation occurs between the buyer and the seller. Okay, but our advice to them is always to secure that. It says that arrange for the receipt of all checks for tenant and security deposit at closing. Well, I think another provision I would put in special provisions would be all rent deposit checks will be cashier's checks. Remember somebody asked me a question earlier about personal? I would never accept a personal check even from my brother. He's good for it, but, you know, I've gotten to that position because you just can't. You know what I'm saying? And that scenario that you had said about they have a check, but it was for 3 days, it hasn't cleared yet, all those things that can occur. Cashier's check, plain and simple.
I asked that question because I just closed on property. You and I talked about that property. Well, my seller was needing his funds at closing in order to move forward with his apartment. Well, he couldn't get a cashier's check or anything until it's funded. So the buyers agreed to let him do a personal check and then with funds, which that next so happened to be that next day they decided last minute to do a mail out. Then they would just hold the check until he, for 3 days, it was a 3-day thing. So that's why I was asking that. Usually I would advise a cashier's check or money order or something like that, but because that situation was a little bit.
And those situations can occur, but you have to have that in special provisions. All the parties are going to agree in writing. It's not going to be in an email, because you don't bind for your client. So just next time, put it in special provisions, and then it should be fine for them. I just don't want something to be agreed in an email, and we can't point to it, that this is what you were willing to accept contractually. Okay. Yeah, it'll save your seller, because the buyer could say, I never said that. And then your seller would be in trouble. It says, you must secure from the tenant access to your property during this lease, so you must have keys or devices that will allow you access to the property. Okay, so the agents never facilitated this properly. Now we've told the tenant what they have to give to the landlord, buyer at closing. Now we're telling the buyer, as the landlord, this is what you have to get from them, okay? Now, you may be around because they're at closing, or they can leave theirs with the escrow officer, and then you go into closing, and then they present it to them. I don't care how that's done, but I want them to know that's their job, okay? In that temporary lease, it doesn't say that, just like our normal where agent has the option check, or they have the earnest money check, and you're tasked with making sure you give it. Now, if your client gives them to you and says, can you get these to the other party? Oh, absolutely, you're gonna do that. That's what you do for them. But I want them to know they should be getting keys, access codes, and checks. Now, what she made a very good comment, years ago, we used to hold those checks. The landlord would say, why don't I just hold this check, and if everything's great when I do our walkthrough, can I give it back to him? I said, I don't care what you do. Because I'm not a part of it, it'll be up to you to determine that. And we have lots of them where they give back that same check because they kind of previewed the property with the tenant there, they looked through it, and they felt everything was done. The problem with that, just so you understand, what if those buyers move in, go to bed, next morning they wake up, and they go to open something in the kitchen, and they can't open it, and they found that there was damage caused? They gave back the security deposit, and that security deposit by law is to ensure the performance. And that could include any damage that's normal, that's above wear and tear, that kind of thing. So again, the parties can agree to do that, but you're never going to advise that. You're going to say, I understand you want to just hand it back to them, but, things can be surfaced in the next day or so when you're really using the property and going into it. You might want to just hold on to it and account for it. They could always send the certified mail back to them if they found everything was okay. But that giving back, we used to do that all the time, and I think that wasn't probably the smartest thing for us to have done. Although we never got calls, but you know what I'm saying? I hear more on the side of all these things that we get thrown into. So just remember that. It's not that they can't do it, just that's that security of them finding something and being able to account for it and have the damages fixed. The last thing it says, also include in the seller's temporary residential lease a date and time that the tenant will surrender the property to you. Again, landlord and tenant will meet at such and such date and time for surrender of property. If the landlord wants cashier's checks, then you're going to add that provision because it doesn't say cashier's check. You know how on our regular lease we have like 6 boxes you can mark? We don't have that in the temporary lease. So if the landlord buyer wants their rent in a cashier's check and those type of things, definitely make sure they can put that notation so the parties are all on the same level. They're all agreeing to the same thing. Now, what I am going to tell you is that the buyer's temporary residential lease, we're going to look at that. It is different than the seller's, but you're going to see a lot of the same paragraphs. Okay? Parties, lease, term, rental. And it says for the buyer to have a temporary residential lease. So here's what could happen. The buyer closed on their property in New Jersey and they're moving to Texas. And the house is vacant. Sellers haven't lived there, maybe the tenants have been there and it's been vacant for us. So nobody's occupying the property that's under contract. So the buyers get this great idea, look, I closed on my house in Jersey. We're not going to be able to close here for 10 days, but I'd like to ask the seller if we can go into the property under a temporary lease. So everybody understands where I stand on this. I would never, ever advise a buyer going into a property under a temporary lease. And I'll tell you why. It doesn't work. We had one here in this operation over 18 months ago that the buyer went in and then the buyer didn't like the condition of the property. And every day it was a new issue that had come up, that the property hadn't been disclosed. And the landlord and owner happened to be a broker. And they were hostile and violent. It was just went on. This poor agent, it was just too much. If a buyer goes into this property and they don't close in fund, they're in breach of this lease. That means beam me up, Scotty. You gotta get out of there right now. You can't have any holdup. So the closing dates can be modified, the terms of the lease can certainly be modified, but the problem is that the landlord, the seller, has asked the listing agent, should I do this? And you're gonna say, look, in my experience, no. In your situation, you're gonna be making 2 mortgage payments, all these things. Yes, you can certainly do whatever you want. I'm just gonna tell you, we don't have the best results from this. And I'm gonna tell you, the times that we have done it, I told the agents they had to put gold bullion outside of my office if I was gonna get any contract from them that had a buyer's temporary residential lease. And what I really meant was, somebody better have a bunch of gold, because you know it's not gonna happen. Every last time, some hiccup, the lender didn't catch, some ratios, they weren't approved. It doesn't happen, yes. And so there we are, the agents are set in a position where they're gonna make you fix everything. And the only thing I know fixes is money, and y'all didn't have a closing and funding, so you didn't get paid. See, that's why it's just not a good scenario at all. I'm not saying that they won't make a decision to do it. Just be very, very, very careful. Yes, sir.
Maryland, if the property is secured by FHA or VA mortgage, isn't that illegal to do that? For them to actually lease that property out, unless it's actually converted to investment type property?
Well, I think under this basis, this is a temporary one, so it's not like they're leasing the property. This is under contract, ready to close. This is a very short time period. So I don't know that they wouldn't have a problem with that. Temporary leases are different, okay? Oh, you got it. Everybody thinks because they're got a mortgage, they can do anything they want with the property. They don't understand that lien holder is in control. That even made the first payment. Exactly. I know. And so, yeah, there are lots of issues. In fact, our attorney, there is a provision that a buyer and seller could enter into an agreement to have what we call a lease purchase. While we have no forms, attorneys have to do them, and there is a very good reason for that. The provisions that you're talking about, the attorney has to draft that in the contractual document for lease purchase. It's very, very burdensome, and they have to be able to hit every one of the statutes. I only have one attorney left that can actually facilitate it and still stand. All the other attorneys have all been sued that we used to advise. They got sued because they didn't do it right because of those provisions. So I never talk about it because those are lawyer territories. And while you might list the property and the parties agree to it, they're going to all lawyer up. They're going to be so lawyered up, there's not one thing they're going to ask you for your opinions and advice. Those are very difficult transactions. But let's look at the temporary lease. Again, it's the interesting part is we've had some temporary leases for cash transactions, right? And the buyer needed to do this, and they were waiting for funds from another closing in another state or whatever. And what happened is the tenant thought they could pay on a monthly basis because they were going to have it for like 60 days. So they thought they would pay the rent on the first of the month and then the next month. And no, they have to fork over all of the money when the lease commences. See, that's the difference for a buyer. It's very punitive. The buyer's got to give all of the lease money. Now, if the buyer went to the seller and said, hey, can I give it to you in installments? Your response as a listing agent will be, I don't recommend that. Absolutely not. Because the other problem was, the buyer got in there and they had to be evicted, they didn't pay the full amount, and the listing agent was in a world of hurt because it was right there in the lease and not everybody understood that. Again, the tenant has to pay the security deposit based on the time of the lease commencing as well. So a full rental amount, make sure you mathematically do it, because again, it asks for the full amount of the rental here, but on the other one, the sellers, it said what? Per day. Okay, so just remember, you gotta calculate all of that. It talks about the same provisions that a landlord has. They took it from the statutes because they knew that nobody would go read it in chapter 92. So they put in there exactly what the landlord is able to do in regards to accounting for the security deposit. The one thing I am going to tell you is that there will be no crossing that the earnest money at any time could be tied as the security deposit. Everybody understand that? Okay. Because a lot of times that's what the parties think. Look, I put $3,500 earnest money down. We'll just leave it that way. Okay, but those two things are not tied. And it says notice. The deposit must be in addition to the earnest money under the contract. So just remember that. Paragraph 10. This alterations is a little different. Remember, the seller tenant. Okay, this is a buyer who doesn't own the property at all. It says tenant may not A, make any holes or drive nails into the woodwork, floors, walls, or ceiling, B, alter, paint, or decorate the property, or C, install improvements or fixtures without the prior written consent of landlord. Any improvements or fixtures placed on the property during the lease become a part of the property. I don't care what you do. You can put this in writing. You could have it tattooed. They're never going to listen to you. And I know this from personal experience. I represented some buyers. He was the Benchmark Mortgage branch manager. He closed on his home in Plano, and we couldn't close this property for, I think it was like 2 weeks or so. But they had just found out they were expecting their first child. So he came to me. He says, Marilyn, it's vacant. I want to go in on there temporarily. I said, those don't work out. I know you're the manager, branch manager, and I know you're going to get your loan, but you know, things can happen. So I went to the listing agent, whom I knew quite well. He said, you know, Marilyn, he said, and he was on a fishing boat. He and the owner, his cousin, were fishing. And they said, yeah, it's fine. Go ahead and draft. Everything's fine. It's okay. We'll let him in. He said, Marilyn, don't be worried. Everything's going to be fine. That's the clue I have that it's not. So we got him in. They had a little pod. You know what pods are? Well, this was when pods first came out. Well, it's a violation to have a pod in the driveway. We had that hiccup with the HOA. The neighbor across the street, my gosh, she was wild. So anyway, I'm on Saturday, I get a call. Marilyn, who's that guy that you recommend for floors? I said, his name is Dusty. Yeah, he said, well, you know, we popped up the tile in the kitchen, and we got the carpeting out of the bedrooms, and I'm going to, you know, paint it because we're doing the nursery and all this, and I'm going, Judy, I told you, you cannot do that. It's okay, Marilyn. I said, it's not okay. You cannot, I'm going to come over there. So I go over there, and that neighbor, she's got a lawn chair. She's focused on this big thing where all they're jumping. I mean, I've got it, had carpeting sticking out from it, baseboard, tile, and I'm just about ready to, you know, have a seizure. And I'm in there, and it's all empty and all this. I said, okay, here's the deal. I said, I know something, and I have to tell the listing agent. I didn't, because I'm not going to be okay, because I can't do that. I had it in writing, and they did it. So I know how people are. You're not going to pay attention, but they needed Dusty's name because they needed some big time because they had just removed everything. It did close. I did call that agent back. He said, it's okay, Marilyn. I'm thinking, I want what he thinks. I just really do. And these are things that hit most cautious agent, the most prudent agent on earth, doing everything perfectly. You're gonna have people who don't do what you say. You know, and so you're gonna have to learn how to handle those things too. As I said, it wasn't that I was a tattler. My concern was, they didn't own that property. If they had uncovered something like, crack, you know,
Foundation.
yeah, that's my business. That's why I showed up on a Saturday to go check it out, because I was afraid of something. Because that's exactly what we normally have problems with. The buyer gets in and finds out something, and now they want to renegotiate with the seller. Do you know it causes this whole element? It's really hard to overcome those objections. It just is on something like that. And so alterations, they can't even put a nail in the wall. Now, how many of you think that a buyer under a buyer's temporary residential lease is not going to put up a picture? Yeah. Oh, well, I'm so afraid. I hang up everything the first night I'm there. My mother-in-law, God rest her soul, she just would stand there and laugh. She said, "Why is it?" I said, "Because now I feel like this is my home." You know, there's just some things you need to be focused on and you see, and it's part of yours. And now my husband says we don't have any wall space. We have nail holes everywhere. And there's special little nails I use that are like a pen. You can buy those at Home Depot too. Yeah, well, yeah, we use those too. Inspections, paragraph 12. Landlord may enter. See, this is the part that's kind of hard. For the tenant didn't like it that somebody was going to come into their property because they still think they own it. But the buyers are, these tenants have to know that the landlord may enter at reasonable times to inspect, replace, repair, or complete the improvements. Sometimes the agreed upon repairs in the contract haven't been completed. Okay, so just remember that. The seller still owns it. They still have obligations under the contract. It says tenant shall provide landlord door keys and access code to allow access to the property during the term of the lease. Repairs, except as otherwise provided in this lease, tenant shall bear all expense of repairing, replacing, and maintaining the property, including but not limited to the yard, tree, shrub, and all the equipment and appliances unless otherwise stated by Texas Property Code. Tenant shall promptly repair at tenant's expense any damage to the property caused directly or indirectly by any act or omission of the tenant or any other person other than the landlord, landlord's agents, or invitees. Okay. The next paragraph is the indemnity. It says the exact same thing that it does for the sellers under temporary residential lease. They have to indemnify the landlord from anything that will happen on the property. Could be their friends come over for a barbecue and the railing breaks and their friend breaks their leg. They're going to indemnify the landlord. Insurance, it says possession of the property by buyer as tenant may change insurance policy coverage. Well, they don't have any coverage unless they have renter's insurance because they don't own the property yet. Default, if tenant fails to perform or observe any provision of this lease and fails within 24 hours after notice by landlord to commence and diligently pursue to remedy such failure, tenant will be in default. It's much like a tenant is not late on the rent payments for how many hours? 24 hours, 1 day. So it might be due on the 1st, but the landlord can't say on the 2nd, you're late. They can only provide that notice on the 3rd day. Okay, so this 24 hours is key through the statutes regarding about notice and giving that other party 24 hours to remedy the situation. It says termination. This lease terminates upon closing and funding under the sale under the contract, or B, termination of the contract prior to closing. That's when the buyer found out that they weren't approved individually. C, tenant's default under this lease, or D, tenant's default under the contract, whichever occurs first. And upon termination, other than by closing and funding of the sale, tenant shall surrender possession of the property. And as I said, it's almost like beam me up. It has to happen immediately. They don't get much time to renegotiate or ask for it. Holdover. Any possession by tenant after termination. Again, we just read how they could terminate. Okay, a provision in the contract it says that creates a tenancy at sufferance and will not operate to renew or extend this lease. Tenant shall pay X number of dollars per day during the period of any possession after termination as damages, in addition to any other remedies to which landlord is entitled. So you can see here that a landlord would put a huge holdover penalty for that buyer if that buyer failed to perform and if they did not surrender the property and they terminated or were in default. Again, because that buyer is in a property now that the landlord's gonna have a lot of expense getting them out. And you know, my friends, when I got them into that house, you can imagine if they had got notified on Monday that JD wasn't gonna be the branch manager of Benchmark Mortgage, right? And they don't have any flooring in that property, and they had a nursery painted. I mean, can you imagine? Oh, it was horrible. Those are two of the longest weeks of my life. I kept calling JD and saying, is there any way we can close early? Like tomorrow? You know? So again, holding over is very important. It should never be zero, ever. And in the case where we had all of the problems just recently, originally the buyer agent has been to my classes, so she put a big dollar amount. And the sellers accepted it. Again, that's a time of offer. Notice how people do things differently. They make different decisions. When they found out that she went back and found out that what I said about FHA was correct, they had to go and get a different term on the temporary lease. And then the sellers were in the driver's position. The sellers would never have accepted this contract. That was, they told us, we would never have accepted this if we could not have stayed in this property. But they did. And they said they would be out on February 19th. And they weren't. Okay. So again, it just is a, you know, a form that nobody really gives much concern to at the time it's attached to the contract. And what I want you as agents to know is that there are some things that you really need to establish with your client, both as a seller and a buyer, before they all agree to digitally sign it and make it a part of the contract. They have to understand what their obligations are. Yes, sir?
Should we really recommend them get a lawyer to look at this if they go into this kind of
Well,
contract? I mean,
you know, there's
just they get
nothing.
advice?
There's nothing wrong with them getting the advice of an attorney. I would like it if they would read. Because reading is fundamental.
And most people don't read.
But I know they don't read. But you know what's interesting, and this is what's so funny, is I said, I had those two attorneys at different times, and I said, let's just read this paragraph. And I did it with tongue in cheek because I'm thinking, please don't tell me you never read it. I understand if other agents don't read it, but an attorney, they know better because they are never allowed to present a document to their client for signing. Their attorneys have an awesome burden on that part. You as agents do too. And I am going to tell you, because I always want to leave you with something so lighthearted and happy, and that y'all don't go run screening from the building, obviously. But I'm going to tell you a little bit before we do the form of the month. I want to talk a little bit about what's going on with TRIP. Because of the CFPB and TRIP regulations, you know, RESPA came down on us starting in the 2000s. RESPA is that part of the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act that said a consumer needs to be told ahead of time what they're going to pay for this, you know, all those kind of things. It was consumer driven. So we had a lot of RESPA regulations. You can't recommend a mortgage company or a residential service contract company if your brokerage operation has a relationship without disclosing all that. You know, those kind of things. Well, here's what's happened. With the RESPA saying, okay, now I'm going to turn all these violations against a consumer, that consumer protection, I'm going to turn it over to the CFPB for handling. So while RESPA had all these things, and RESPA attorneys get like $700 an hour. Yeah, because it's a really so highly specialized. So what happened is when they said we're going to turn over these complaint issues and violations over to the CFPB, and CFPB is sitting over there, they have no oversight, they get to ding you whatever you want if you're a lender and all this. There's a lot of concern, and what they did is they put in there about consumer protection. In other words, you know our information about brokerage services? You can never, ever give that form blank, and it's because of all these regulations on the Consumer Protection Act. They accommodated what the federal requirements and regulations are. In other words, the poor consumer, they have to know that they can go to you and who they can go that's above you and above them and up at the top on the brokerage. In other words, that's why our forms changed so radically. Okay? They wanted to make sure that the consumer had that stepping stone of who do I go to file a complaint or lodge an issue. Okay. Well, and then I told you earlier that we have a lot of lenders who don't want to share the closing disclosures with the realtor because they're afraid you're going to find something and the loan closing will be delayed because of the 3-day regulation. Well, advertising at Trek is a huge, huge issue. Okay, we have the regulations. We know exactly, as an agent, I know exactly what I'm able to do in advertising. We see violations of it all the time. I'll drive just around here and my journey back to where my sister lives, and I will stop at a stoplight and I see a Keller Williams sign, and I can barely see, I know the agent, I can barely see Keller Williams. Keller Williams has to be 50% of the largest print of the agent. And I took a picture, sent it to the broker that night. I said, well, I was stopped in traffic. I just thought I'd share this with you. And, you know, it's horrible because they've gone out, agents have made all of these, you know, signs and other things. And we know that somebody not so friendly is going to say, you're violating advertising. Well, based upon all these consumer protection, Trek has now proposed, I think, a heavily burdensome rules that you as agents and brokers will have to abide by. Bob Hill, who's the president of HAR, is hosting a symposium, and the Trek people are coming in. Several of the attorneys that I work with, I've told them to come and be on the side of champion for the agents to try and get Trek to not impact these new rules. It was bad enough when they told you you had to have these completed and on your website. You know, you can no longer just put information about brokerage service. It has to be completed. You have to post it on your website. You can't just put a little moniker at the bottom of your email. You have to tell them in the body of your email, please see the attached information. You know, all these things that you are now under deep scrutiny for. Trek wants to come in and say that you have to add all this language on every sign for your car, for your houses, for your advertising, your magazine, all of it. And it was sent to me, redlined by an attorney who's representing HAR. And it kind of goes in, and HAR went, and if you read what Trek wanted, and the attorney for HAR just put red lines through all of it and modified it so that it would not be overly burdensome. But kind of pay attention. If your board sends out a notice, we need you to comment on this or send your how you feel about it, do it. It's in your best interest. Because if they get their way and Trek gets to enforce these things, it's going to cost us so much money to reprint everything. And the cost to comply with it that the broker would have to do is cost prohibitive. And that affects our profit sharing big time. And I don't want that. So just remember, a lot of things are coming as a result of this Consumer Protection Act. And Trek is responding in the most severe way you can ever imagine. But fortunately, you have your board president is very proactive. The attorneys are as well. I just want you to know to kind of be prepared for it. When I read it at first, I thought somebody was pulling my leg. And then I saw where it came from. And I recognized it came from Trek. And what they had done is redlined it saying, we don't want this, we don't want that. And so it's just one of those things. We're in an age where, because these laws are changing, they have effect on us in our production and how we work. Just be prepared for that. Now, the form of the month. We have a form, and if you they're really a pseudo for sale by owner. They actually put it in MLS. Okay? They've got some listing brokers to do, quote, put it in MLS. And these brokers and agents who do these limited services, they literally think, oh, I just have to put it in MLS and I don't have to be bothered. And on our information about brokerage services, it states at the very top what the duties, the minimum duties are for every listing broker. So it's really nice because now we see it. But what we've got a situation here is where there is a limited brokerage agreement. The thing is that Trek will never allow the listing broker to limit the duties of presenting all offers, explaining all the forms, and assisting the sellers in understanding the time limits. In other words, performance on their part. These are all things that the listing agent has to do, no matter what kind of limited brokerage agreement they have. But if you look at this form, nobody has to sign it. I like that form. Okay. It says to, and it's the sellers, from, this is Keller Williams Realty, and you can put your agent name on that. It's regarding the property, okay, and the date. And it says, A, your real estate broker has asked that I deliver the enclosed offer to you. Right now, what we see in MLS is contact the seller for all showings, present all the offers to the seller. This is what the listing agent puts in agent remarks. I want you to be protected because that seller thinks they're paying your commission and they own you. Even though you don't represent them. You represent the buyer. But that's how they act. Because I've listened to them on the phone when they call and complain. So again, just be very careful because you're kind of going into a treacherous kind of condition, and I don't want y'all to be pulled in by this seller who is already represented by a listing broker. It says B, my client is the prospective buyer. C, I am obliged to inform my client of any material information you provide to me. So you know how these sellers are, they just talk up a storm and talk. And you have to turn around and give it to your buyer and you're gonna say, this is what the seller just told me. You don't get to hide anything from them. D, I will not provide you with 1, opinions or advice. 2, assistance in evaluating any offer. 3, assistance in drafting any offer, response to any offer, disclosure, notice, or other information. Number 4, relevant market information. Number 5, information related to any contractual duty you may have, like the seller's time limits, those types of things. Number 6, assistance in arranging for the completion of any obligations you may be required to meet under a contract. Do you think seller required repairs? They want you to come in and supervise this and tell them what to do? Or 7, information related to other service providers such as title companies, mortgage companies, insurance companies, attorneys, inspectors, contractors, surveyors, engineers, and others. E, I encourage you to contact your broker or your attorney for assistance. Texas Real Estate Commission rules provide that a broker is obligated under a listing agreement to negotiate the best possible transaction for the principal seller. And as I said, if you had a true for sale by owner, you could take this language and say, I will not. And just so it's clear, because for sale by owners, how many of you have ever worked with for sale by owners? Yes. I would never work for one. I didn't do expired listings, my thing is that they have very little respect for us in our profession. So I kind of drew the line. If my buyer really wanted a for sale by owner, it was going to cost dearly. That's one way to kind of not have those transactions. And part of it was because no matter what, when you got them to sign their registration agreement between broker and owner that they're going to pay your compensation, they thought they owned you. That's how a for sale by owner does it, But they won't listen to anything you say because you're not valuable in the transaction. That's why I listed the property myself, because I know everything. And yet they're going to ask you everything because they don't know anything. So a lot of this. But it's interesting, this form, because of the time of year, and we see this a lot more, I want you to be prepared. pull this form out and use it. If you are in that situation where it's listed with the broker and MLS, but they've instructed you to quote, send the offer to the seller, okay, directly. I'm just gonna tell you that when you're in that situation, anything you send to the seller has to be CC'd at the same time to the listing broker, okay? We had that one in Plano, I think they're in Plano outside of Dallas, who I told the agent, CC them, and he sent back, he said, quit sending me this. I said, you tell him that your risk manager said that he has to do his brokerage agreement with his seller. We are not gonna negotiate this with the seller. And oh, by the way, send him this, and I sent him a printout, a white paper from our attorneys at TAR about that. And we didn't have any more problems. I think you might have read it. You never know how that works. But again, my biggest concern is that there are lots of these great forms that TAR has provided us. A lot of them. And we don't use them. And the broker doesn't have it on the checklist and say, you must use this. Because every time we do that, you don't review it with your clients. You may have it signed digitally, but I just have no proof that you ever reviewed it with me. I want these documents that you use to facilitate the transaction to be at the tip of your tongue, able to explain them and review them with your clients, take your questions, and prove that you are absolutely proficient in understanding it. Now, if they ask you a legal question, you're not a lawyer. You didn't say Keller Williams Law Firm. So you would say, you know what, that's a legal interpretation. I can't give that. But you need to contact your attorney, and they'll say, do you have some attorneys you can recommend? And I can recommend some that have done consistent good work in responding to our clients and that type of thing. Yes, sir.
Marilyn, I got an interesting situation. I've got a listing in the sellers of in Dallas, and so I got a referral. I got an agent up there. I'm doing it, and so my seller went up there, and this lady brought them all around, and she's a Keller Williams agent, and she called me a day or two after the people were up there, and she said, hey, what's this CFP, Consumer Fraud Protection Bureau form? We don't use this up here. We don't.
I created it.
They're not using it up there.
Well, of course not. I'm not going to give it to them. I only give it to the brokerage that I work for. And the reason I do that is because I do this just like the acknowledgments I gave today. You're not going to find those anywhere other than the Keller Williams offices that I work for.
Okay.
So that's,
a law or something.
no. It does talk about the laws that were passed, and they could be subject to them. And that's what I want the clients to know, both sellers and buyers. But when I create these forms are ours, and they turned up in a package of Remax. And my attorney, who I read it from, Steve Rogers, at the very bottom, he had, just like my PowerPoints, are all copyrighted. And because he said that they said they found it evidently through a transaction that they must have had before, and they used it and copied it. And the silly thing is they left Keller Williams on it. It doesn't make any sense on that respect. And my thing is that I don't like, the broker, your broker, Michael Clapp, he had list of requirements. When a broker that I join an operation, I don't go in and say, well, we need to change all this. That's the way they've been doing business. That's their discretion. But as things come up that we have to be alerted to, that we have to make sure that our agents have gone through with their clients, then from time to time we'll say, well, we're adding this addendum to that. I am working with Nicole Joyce to try and make your listing packet on the addenda. I'm going to mark each extra form that you should always have attached to the listing agreement. And I'm going to have Nicole package it so that when you go into the version now for the forms, you're going to pull your listing and it's going to have all of those addenda attached to it all in one. Okay? And the reason I'm doing that is I'm trying to figure out how, instead of remembering to go to get each one of these separate forms and get them signed, your seller, if it was all attached to the listing agreement, their initials and their signature, and if it's marked that the addenda are there, that's there. It's going to have the CFPB It's also gonna have, the notation about the multiple offer situation, because we override a provision in the listing agreement. We don't ever disclose terms to other offers, okay? And then the last one is, in light of sellers, completing the seller's disclosure, while we don't instruct them how to do it, we always tell them disclose, disclose, disclose. And so I'm gonna have an addenda that's gonna say, before you complete the seller's disclosure, please remember, and it's gonna be some helpful points about it. It's gonna kind of seem silly, but I'm gonna say, don't say that all the doors and windows work unless you've tried every one of them. That is the biggest issue, is that somebody does, and I know, I don't have any children at my home that live with me anymore. I only had an only son, but I'm so glad he's gone. But he can bring back my grandson. My grandson's a year old, and I love him. He can. But I don't go into those bedrooms anymore because I have my bedroom on the first floor, and my husband has his office upstairs. Well, that's his kind of domain. Bless his heart, men don't get their closets. You gotta give him some space. So I gave him the upstairs, and I'll ask him. I said something about, is such and such a thing. He said, I don't even go into those rooms. So how could I say that all the windows and everything, you know what I'm saying? I'd have to literally go in there and open them and fix it and make sure that it's there. And I think what happens, we get caught a lot of times in the minutia on the seller's disclosure. In other words, I don't want anything blank. I can tell you that will cause you a problem. I know that for a fact. We've been in lawsuits on it. So it's not like you know the answer to the fill in the blank. I just don't want it blank. Roof type and age. Nobody ever remembers to do that. And so what happens on this is I just want them to know that they need to take a lot of time to disclose. And it talks also about even if you fix something and it has anything to do with water penetration, a leak, you better disclose. And the reason we know for a fact all of our lawsuits is if a buyer knew that there had been a previous leak and the seller fixed it this way, the buyer, during their option period, would have to do their due diligence to make sure it was fixed right. They can't sue the seller unless the seller didn't tell them. And we don't have any form that says previous water penetration. Trek put previous in front of a lot of their words. TAR adopted it. That was because of all the lawsuits. But they don't do it all in water penetration. They just say water penetration. But I know we've had more issues where that one element, even though the seller thought they'd fixed it, the buyers in the property, they find out and they say, oh, if I'd known this, I never would have bought it. Or we open it up and you never fixed it right. It's kind of like that leak. And again, I told them, per the contract, everybody said they would mediate. And that means that they're going to have to reach a resolution. If they cannot reach a resolution through mediation, somebody's going to wind up in court. Our job as agents is not to get people in court. Your job is to avoid conflict. Did you know that? And I'll tell you what's interesting about avoiding conflict. You're a listing agent. You get an offer, and there are blanks. Blanks on paragraphs that you know have to either have something completed or value. What do you do as a listing agent? There you do. You stop the process and bring it to the attention of the other agent. You don't say to the seller, they didn't fill this out. It's going to be on their agent because their agent is negligent and doesn't know what they're doing. We had a listing agent who put that in writing to me. The broker had to let him go. Yeah. Because I don't play the game, I got you. That's not how we work. That listing agent acting that way put them in conflict. Guess where the conflict's going to be resolved? In the court. Yeah. And so the broker sent the notice and said, cease and desist this. And this is not how we are here in this operation. And the agent continued to argue. Well, as I said, they got what they deserved. But the problem is they were wanting to go into conflict because they had I got you. We don't do that. Now, what I told the broker, I said, most of the time, both agents missed it. That I don't have a problem with so much. You know what I'm saying? Because if you both missed it, it wasn't like one of them was using it over the other. And then the two are gonna have to come together and say, we need to make this right, we need to do an amendment to fix this. And it came about the dispute in third-party financing addendum. Paragraph D, it's a provision that involves FHA and VA. And it's the only fill in the blank on that paragraph. And you have to have sales price in that blank. If you leave it blank, you could be in trouble as the agent. Not so much the listing agent, but the buyer agent will be in serious trouble. And I'm gonna explain why. There's a paragraph B2 that says property approval. So the lender could say, the property hasn't met approval. There's a provision the buyer can terminate and get their earnest money back, okay? If you leave the provision about VA and FHA blank, and it's an FHA purchaser, and for some fluke, the lender doesn't decline the property. Okay, again, the lender has that provision in B2 to say it doesn't need property approval. But the buyer says, I want to terminate because it didn't appraise or whatever. The problem for the buyer is if the buyer agent left that blank, they do not have a provision to terminate. Okay, so again, it's one of those, really freaky kind of situations. It would have to be that the lender would not decline the property approval, and yet that blank was left there. And we do have, believe it, we have a lot of FHA and VA purchasers. And VA, the statute says you can never force them even if you left a blank. VA protects their veterans. But for FHA purchasers, it's not the same statutorial effect. So just remember, blanks should not be overlooked or discarded. Get it taken care of. I do understand if you both miss it, and hopefully when we do compliance, we won't miss it, and we'll bring it to your attention, and you can do an amendment. But you have to remember, we're not in it to cause conflict. That's not the agent's role. It's really to be cooperative and to bring to the attention. And I'm going to tell you something. This is my own personal opinion, but your operation is really a very, very good operation. What I mean by that is the agents seated next to you and those that didn't come are really good. They don't get into trouble. They don't get into conflict. They could have crazy clients, but that's how it goes. But you have an exemplary operation. And most of the time, people would say, well, Marilyn, don't you want them to have problems? So it gives you job security. And I think of it, I sleep much better at night knowing that y'all are all okay, because that's the whole culture that it is here. So I applaud you. I have a lot of respect for you. I've done this job. I know exactly what you cannot tell me a story that I won't be able to top. Because again, I was thrown everything, and then you just keep on going. You learn from it, and you figure out ways the next time not to have it. But you really are in a very wonderful brokerage operation, and it starts at the top. The leadership is like that. As I said, you'll never find her not doing the right thing, and I think that speaks volumes, and it really is. I wish all of you a very blessed Easter and a holiday season, and I'll see you next month.